The embossed wedding invitation lay on a damp bus stop bench, glinting faintly under the streetlight. I didn't know why I picked it up. It wasn't addressed to me, but curiosity tugged harder than common sense. The ornate design, gold trim, and unfamiliar names piqued my interest. Something about it felt deliberate, like it was meant to be found. That weekend, I drove to the venue, a grand estate nestled in the woods. The building was illuminated by hundreds of lights, and the sound of muffled laughter spilled into the night. Inside, the ceremony was lavish. Crystal chandeliers, rows of perfect white roses, and a sea of impeccably dressed guests. They barely acknowledged me, yet no one questioned my presence. I slipped into a seat near the back, trying to blend in. As the bride walked down the aisle, I noticed she wasn't smiling. Her steps were rigid, and her gaze darted to the groom, who stood stiffly at the altar. Around him were men in dark suits, whispering to him at intervals, their faces grim. The reception was even stranger. The guests mingled, but their conversations felt muted, like they were only going through the motions. I stayed near the edge of the room, sipping a drink and observing. That's when I overheard two men in suits, their voices low but urgent. Still missing, one of them said, "You'd think they'd know better than to run." The other nodded grimly. "We'll deal with it, but tonight has to go as planned." I froze. The words didn't seem to fit the celebration. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't discussing the wedding. They were talking about someone. Before I could leave, one of the men approached me, his expression sharp and assessing. "Where's your name tag?" he asked. I didn't get one," I stammered, my heart pounding. He frowned, his eyes narrowing. "That's not possible." I tried to excuse myself, but before I could move, the groom appeared beside me. His grip on my wrist was iron, his face pale. "You can't leave until your part is done," he whispered, his tone urgent. Panic overtook me, and I yanked my arm free, bolting toward the exit. But the double doors were locked. The room grew quieter, and I felt eyes turning my way, the weight of their stares suffocating. "Stay calm," the man in the suit said, stepping closer. "It's better if you cooperate." I didn't wait to hear what he meant. I ran to the nearest window, throwing it open and scrambling out into the night. The last thing I heard was a voice shouting behind me, "You can't escape what's already started." The next morning, the invitation was gone. My phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You left before your roll. We will find you." Now, I can't shake the feeling that the wedding wasn't just an event. It was something far more sinister, and I was meant to play a part in it. The park had always been my escape, a quiet place where I could sit on my favorite bench and watch the world pass by. It was the kind of spot where the breeze carried a hint of pine, and the sounds of children laughing mixed with the occasional bark of a dog. That evening was no different. I had my coffee, my headphones, and the solitude I'd come to cherish. Until he sat down. The man looked ordinary enough. Mid-40s, neatly dressed with a face that didn't stand out. He smiled politely and said, "Lovely evening, isn't it?" "Sure," I muttered, keeping my headphones on. But his presence unsettled me. He wasn't looking at the park, his eyes were fixed on me. "You used to play soccer here, didn't you?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual. My head snapped up. "What?" He nodded toward the field. "Back in high school, you were number 14. I stared at him. "How do you know that?" He smiled again, wider this time. "We've met before, haven't we?" "No, I don't think so," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I grabbed my bag and left, his gaze following me until I disappeared around the corner. The next day, I spotted him across the street from my apartment building. He was leaning against a lamppost, pretending to scroll on his phone, but I knew he was watching. My heart pounded as I ducked inside. A week passed, and he was everywhere, at the grocery store, at the coffee shop I frequented, even sitting in his car outside my gym. Each time, he'd catch my eye and give a small nod, like we shared a secret I couldn't remember. Finally, I confronted him. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, finding him sitting on a bench outside my workplace. He looked up amused. "I'm not following you," he said simply. "Really? You just happen to be everywhere I am?" He leaned back, crossing his legs. "You keep forgetting." "Forget what?" I snapped, but he just chuckled and stood, walking away without answering. That night, I went through my old photos, trying to figure out if we really had met before. Nothing. His face wasn't in any picture, and I couldn't recall a single memory of him. But then I noticed something strange. In several photos, ones from years ago, there was a shadowy figure in the background. Sometimes in a cafe window, sometimes at the edge of a park. Always blurry, but unmistakably him. I started staying home, closing the blinds and locking every door. But even in my apartment, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. When I glanced at my reflection in the window one night, I swore I saw him standing behind me, smiling faintly. I don't go to the park anymore. In fact, I barely go anywhere. Because no matter where I am, I know he'll already be there, waiting, as if he's orchestrating my life from the shadows. The flyer was tucked under my windshield wiper, its edges frayed like it had been handled too many times. Midnight performance, it read, promising a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I wasn't much of a theater person, but something about the invitation intrigued me. Maybe it was the oddity of a play starting at midnight or the ornate design of the flyer, almost like it had been crafted for me specifically. That night, I found myself standing outside an old, crumbling theater tucked away in an alley downtown. The marquee was dim, its letters faded, but a faint glow seeped from beneath the heavy wooden doors. The other attendees were eerily quiet, filing in without a word. There was no line, no ticket booth, just an usher who nodded as I walked past, as though he'd been expecting me. The auditorium was half empty, with seats arranged in perfect rows. I took a spot near the back, observing the audience. They sat stiffly, their faces illuminated by the faint light from the stage. It felt less like anticipation and more like they were waiting for something inevitable. When the play began, I nearly laughed. It was mundane at first. A living room set, actors exchanging pleasantries about a family dinner. But then the dialogue shifted. The actors were reciting lines from a conversation I'd had with my sister just last week. My exact words. My tone. I glanced around, expecting someone to react, but the audience remained silent, their eyes fixed on the stage. My heart pounded as I leaned toward the person sitting next to me and whispered, "Do you hear that? They're talking about me." They nodded without looking at me. "It's your turn soon." I tried to leave, but the aisle seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly toward the exit. When I turned back, one of the actors had stepped off the stage, their eyes locking onto mine. "You can't leave," they said, breaking character. Their voice boomed, though they hadn't raised it. "Your scene is next." Before I could react, two ushers appeared, gripping my arms and dragging me toward the stage. The audience turned their heads in unison, their gazes heavy and unblinking. On the stage, they handed me a script. My name was printed at the top, the pages filled with words I'd never spoken but felt like I could have. The actor from before stood across from me, waiting. "Read," they commanded, their voice echoing through the room. The words spilled out of me, unbidden, like they'd been buried deep in my mind. As I spoke, my voice reverberated through hidden speakers, overlapping with whispers of the same lines, as though the theater had recorded me long before I'd ever arrived. When I finally looked up, the audience was gone, the seats empty. The spotlight burned brighter, and the actor in front of me stepped closer, their face suddenly resembling mine. They grinned as the lights dimmed, leaving me alone in the dark. The next morning, I found the flyer on my kitchen table. But now, the showtime listed wasn't midnight. It was 7 p.m. that same evening, and my name was printed under lead role. The river was calm that morning, its surface rippling softly under the breeze. I had come to skip rocks, as I often did to clear my mind, when something glinted in the shallow water. At first, I thought it was a coin, but as I waded in, I realized it was a rusted key. It was old, with an ornate design on the head that seemed out of place in the modern world. I slipped it into my pocket and headed back toward town, figuring it was just some trinket lost to time. But as I walked through the streets, people I didn't recognize began glancing at me. Not just casual looks, but sharp, purposeful stares. One man whispered something to a woman as I passed, and they both turned to watch me. By the time I got home, the unease was gnawing at me. I tried to laugh it off, but the feeling only grew when I found a small chest sitting on my doorstep. The chest was as old as the key, its wood worn smooth, and its corners wrapped in tarnished metal. My name was etched into the lid, alongside the same intricate design that adorned the key. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, the key fitting perfectly into the rusted lock. Inside was a journal, its cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age. The first page had my full name written in an elegant, deliberate script. The entries were cryptic, filled with symbols and fragments of sentences. The gatekeeper must never falter. Protect the artifact at all costs. The marked will follow. I didn't understand any of it, but the handwriting sent chills down my spine. It felt familiar, like I had written it myself. That night, as I tried to sleep, there was a knock at my door. I froze, the sound too deliberate, too heavy for a random visitor. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the porch. They wore a long coat, their hat obscuring their face. "You're late," the voice said, muffled but clear. "Hand it over." I didn't respond. My heart pounded as I stepped back, gripping the chest tightly. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but when I finally looked out the window, the figure was gone. The next day, I tried to get rid of the chest. I drove to a nearby forest and buried it deep beneath the roots of an old tree. But when I returned home, it was sitting on my kitchen table, dirt still clinging to its edges. I locked it in the basement, then in the trunk of my car, but it always found its way back to me. The journal's pages began to change, new entries appearing in my own handwriting, though I hadn't touched a pen. Now, every night, the knocking returns. Sometimes it's louder, sometimes softer, but it's always there. The journal's latest entry simply reads, "The gatekeeper cannot escape their duty." And I'm beginning to think it's right. It was just past midnight, and I needed milk for my morning coffee. My usual store was closed, so I kept driving until I spotted a small grocery store I'd never noticed before. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pale green glow over the parking lot. The inside was dimly lit, the aisles narrow and lined with shelves that looked like they hadn't been restocked in years. "Good evening," the clerk said as I stepped in. He was an older man, wearing a stained apron and a crooked smile. What caught me off guard wasn't his greeting. It was the fact that he called me by name. I paused. "Do I know you?" He shrugged. "We get all kinds of regulars." I grabbed a basket and wandered the aisles. The first thing that struck me as odd was the specificity of the items. My favorite coffee brand was there, one I hadn't seen in years. The cereal my dad used to buy when I was a kid was on the next shelf, its packaging faded but intact. On the far wall, I spotted a jacket identical to the one I lost in college, hanging neatly as if waiting for me. The air grew heavy, thick with a sense of something watching. I turned, half expecting someone to be behind me, but the aisle was empty. Only the faint hum of the flickering lights kept me company. At the register, the clerk scanned my items with slow, deliberate movements. "You found everything you needed," he said, though it wasn't a question. "How do you stock all this?" I asked, gesturing to the basket. "It's like you knew what I wanted." He leaned in slightly, his smile fading. "We stock what you need." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I paid quickly, desperate to leave, but when I reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, but it felt like it was bolted shut. "Is there a problem?" the clerk asked from behind me. "The door's locked," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head, his expression blank. "Not until you finish shopping." "What are you talking about?" "I already paid," I snapped, turning to face him. His eyes darkened, and he gestured toward the aisles. "You missed something. Go back." Panic began to creep in. I stepped away from the door, my breath shallow. The store suddenly felt larger, the aisles stretching endlessly into the shadows. Items I hadn't seen before filled the shelves. Old photographs, handwritten notes, objects I thought I'd lost long ago. One photo caught my eye. It was of me standing in this very store holding a basket, but I hadn't been here before tonight. Had I? I turned back to the clerk, but he was gone. The store was silent now, save for the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. I ran to the door, pounding on it, but it wouldn't give. Then the lights flickered, and a voice echoed from the aisles. "You can't leave until you take what's yours." When the lights came back on, the store was empty, and my basket was gone. The door swung open effortlessly, but I haven't been back since. And yet, the same receipt appears in my pocket every morning, reminding me of what I left behind. After dinner with friends, I stepped into the cool night air and hailed the first cab I saw. The yellow taxi pulled up almost instantly, its windows darkened and the driver barely visible. I slipped into the back seat, grateful to get out of the cold. "Where to?" he asked. "Main Street near 5th, I said. He chuckled softly, adjusting the rearview mirror. "I know where you're going." I froze. "What?" He didn't answer, instead pulling into traffic. The city lights blurred outside the window, but something about the route felt wrong. After a few minutes, I noticed we weren't heading toward Main Street. The streets became unfamiliar, quieter, the kind of roads you didn't take unless you lived nearby. "This isn't the right way," I said, my voice edged with unease. "Relax," the driver said, his tone calm but dismissive. "I'll get you there." I leaned forward to get a better look at him, but the shadows in the car seemed to deepen. His features were obscured, his face barely visible in the dim light from the dashboard. Then I noticed something on the dash, a photograph. It was me. "What the hell is that?" I demanded, pointing at the photo. He didn't glance at it. "Standard policy. We like to know our passengers." The note under the photo caught my eye. "Ask no questions." Panic started to claw at my chest. "Stop the car." "Let me out." He ignored me, his hands steady on the wheel. "It's too late for that." I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were engaged, and the buttons on my side didn't work. I banged on the glass, shouting for help, but the streets outside were deserted. The driver started talking again, his voice eerily calm. "You know, every passenger thinks they're the first, that they're special, but you all end up the same. What are you talking about? I demanded, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he began telling stories about passengers who'd vanished, people who were delivered somewhere, never seen again. The car slowed as we entered an industrial area. Warehouses loomed on either side, their windows dark and empty. He pulled into a lot, the headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the ground. "This isn't where I need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's where you're supposed to be," he replied. The engine idled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. I braced myself, my mind racing through escape plans. Before I could act, the passenger door swung open. Standing there was another man, dressed in dark clothes, his face shadowed under a cap. He gestured for me to get out. I hesitated, but the driver spoke again. "If you don't, it'll only get worse." I stepped out, my legs trembling. The man grabbed my arm, guiding me toward one of the warehouses. Behind me, the cab's taillights disappeared into the fog. I never saw the driver's face clearly, but I'll never forget his final words. "Some places aren't meant to be left." I woke up hours later, back on Main Street, my phone missing and no memory of what happened inside the warehouse. The only thing in my pocket was a receipt for the ride, the words "fare paid in full" scrawled at the bottom. But I know I didn't pay, and I don't know what it cost me. When I moved into my new apartment, the quiet was a relief. The city noise outside was muffled, and the neighbors kept to themselves. Too much, in fact. 6 months passed, and I realized I'd never met anyone on my floor. No chance encounters in the elevator, no sounds of footsteps or music through the thin walls. Just silence. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I noticed faint movement through the window of the apartment across the hall, just a shadow passing by. Deciding it was time to introduce myself, I walked over and knocked on the door. After a long pause, a man opened it, his expression blank, his face almost unnaturally still. "You're not supposed to be here," he said flatly. I blinked. "I'm just saying hello. I live across the hall." His eyes darted past me, scanning the empty hallway. "Leave." The door slammed shut before I could respond. The next morning, I mentioned the encounter to my landlord. He frowned, his coffee mug pausing midair. "Which apartment?" "4B," I said, confused by the sudden tension in his expression. "We don't rent that unit anymore," he replied, his voice low. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's living there. I saw him last night." He shook his head. "That floor's been closed for years. No one's supposed to be there." I couldn't let it go. That night, I sat in the hallway, watching the door to 4B. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just silence, the kind that made you aware of every breath you took. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint scraping sound like furniture being dragged across the floor. The light under the door flickered, as if someone were pacing back and forth. I approached the door, pressing my ear against it. "Hello," I called softly. The pacing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't have stayed." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The door didn't open, but the air in the hallway felt heavier, oppressive. I returned to my apartment, locking every bolt, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The numbers on 4BS door were gone, just blank, as though the apartment had never existed. Over the next few days, I tried asking other tenants about 4B, but they either avoided the topic or claimed they'd never noticed the unit. The landlord refused to discuss it further, insisting I focus on my own apartment. One night, as I was falling asleep, I heard it again, the faint scraping, but this time from the wall behind my bed. I haven't heard from my neighbors since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear movement in the hallway. And once, when I glanced through the peephole, I saw the man from 4B, standing there, motionless. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. And now, I don't know if he ever left. It was past midnight when my car sputtered to a stop on a lonely stretch of road. No warning, no strange sounds, just dead. The nearest town was miles away, and my phone signal was non-existent. The night was moonless, the darkness pressing in, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves. I was weighing my options when headlights appeared in the distance. A tow truck rumbled toward me, its lights cutting through the void. The driver leaned out of the window, a man in his late 50s with a wide grin and a ball cap pulled low. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice cheerful, almost too cheerful for the situation. Relieved, I nodded. "Yeah, my car just died." "Hop in," he said, hooking up my car with practiced ease. "Garage isn't far. You'll be back on the road in no time." The garage was tucked away, barely more than a shack with a flickering neon sign. Inside, the air was heavy with oil and rust, and the walls were lined with tools that looked older than I was. The driver, who introduced himself as Dale, pointed to a chair near a grimy counter. "Sit tight," he said. "Won't take long." As he worked, I wandered outside to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed the back lot. It was filled with cars, dozens of them, parked haphazardly and covered in dirt and leaves. Their windows were fogged, and their tires flat, like they'd been abandoned for years. But it wasn't the cars that made my stomach twist. It was the belongings left inside. Suitcases, clothes, photographs. A child's teddy bear sat on one dashboard, its stitching loose and its button eyes dull. "What are you doing back there?" Dale's voice cut through the night, sharp and cold. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his friendly grin gone. "These cars, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be poking around. I was curious." "Curiosity gets people in trouble," he said, stepping closer. Something about his tone made me take a step back. "I think I'll call for a ride," I said, fumbling for my phone, though I knew it wouldn't work. He chuckled, low and humorless. "No signal out here. That's why I'm around." I glanced past him toward the garage door, calculating my chances of making it to the road. "Where are the owners of those cars?" I asked, my voice firmer now. His grin returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They didn't finish paying." I ran. My feet pounded against the gravel as I sprinted toward the highway, the sound of Dale's boots heavy behind me. The tow truck's headlights flared to life, blinding me for a moment. But I didn't stop. I don't remember how long I ran, but eventually I found myself on the main road. A passing car slowed, its driver rolling down the window to ask if I needed help. I looked back, but the tow truck and Dale were gone, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, I returned with the police, but the garage was empty. No cars, no tools, no Dale. Just an overgrown lot with no sign anyone had been there in years. I don't drive at night anymore, because I know that not every friendly face on the roadside is there to help. The flyer was on my windshield, a bright splash of color against the dull gray of the parking lot. "Free concert tonight," it read, featuring a band I used to follow in college. I hadn't thought about them in years, but nostalgia pulled me in. The venue wasn't far, just an outdoor stage at the edge of town, so I decided to go. When I arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The stage was bathed in blue and purple lights, the crowd buzzing with excitement. A man at the gate handed me a bracelet, a plain white band that he insisted I wear. "For security," he said with a smile. I slipped it on without thinking and joined the throng of people pressing toward the stage. The music was incredible, better than I remembered. The crowd swayed and cheered, their movements synchronized like a single, living organism. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unsettling. Some people weren't moving at all. They stood perfectly still, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused. It was as if the music was playing around them, not to them. I tried to brush it off, telling myself they were just tired or distracted. But the longer I stayed, the more people I noticed with that same eerie stillness. After about an hour, I decided to leave. The music was good, but the atmosphere was starting to feel oppressive. When I turned to head back to the gate, a security guard stepped in front of me. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone flat. "I'm heading out," I said, pointing to the parking lot. "Concert's not over yet," he replied, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. I laughed nervously. "It's a free concert. I can leave whenever I want." He shook his head slowly. "Not with that bracelet on." I looked down at the white band on my wrist, suddenly aware of its weight. I tried to slide it off, but it wouldn't budge. It felt tighter than before, almost as if it was constricting on its own. "I don't want any trouble," I said, stepping back. The guard didn't move, but his expression darkened. "Trouble starts when you leave before you're dismissed." I pushed past him, ignoring his shouts, and headed toward the parking lot. But no matter how far I ran, the stage seemed to stay in view. The music grew louder, the cheers of the crowd echoing in my ears. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't find my car. The lot stretched endlessly, filled with empty spaces but no exits. When I turned back toward the venue, the crowd was gone. The stage was dark, and the bracelets on the ground glowed faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, the bracelet gone, but a faint white mark still circling my wrist. On my nightstand was another flyer for the concert, this time with the words "Encore Performance Tonight" printed across the top. And this time, my name was listed in the lineup. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as I stepped inside, the tile floor damp from the rain. A man washing his hands nodded at me, and a teenager was texting in the corner, leaning against the wall near the sinks. Everything about the space felt ordinary, unremarkable. I went into the stall, the door creaking as I locked it. The faint hum of the lights mixed with the muffled conversations from outside, creating a comforting background noise. But when I stepped out, the bathroom was completely silent. The sinks were still wet, the hand dryer ticking as if recently used. But the man and the teenager were gone. I glanced at the door, which hung slightly ajar. Maybe they'd left quickly, I told myself. I moved to the sink to wash my hands. That's when I noticed the mirror. It didn't reflect the room as it was now. Instead, it showed the bustling scene I'd walked into earlier. The man washing his hands, the teenager texting, and myself entering the stall. I stared at the mirror, my heart pounding. The reflection didn't match reality. The man glanced at the teenager in the reflection and said something I couldn't hear, their mouths moving in silence. It felt as if I were watching a memory play out, but it wasn't one I recognized. I backed away, my breathing shallow. When I turned toward the door, I noticed something else. The flickering light above the exit wasn't flickering anymore. In fact, it wasn't on at all. The room felt darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I pushed open the door, desperate to leave, only to find myself in a hallway instead of the gas station's convenience store. The air was colder, the walls lined with old, peeling posters for movies I'd never heard of. The faint hum of the lights was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. As I moved down the hallway, my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. Each door I passed was locked, their handles cold and unyielding. I kept walking, hoping to find an exit, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, I came to a door slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. Inside was a small, dimly lit room with a single chair in the center. On the chair was a piece of paper with my name scrawled across it. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run. But as I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me. The light flickered, and the walls seemed to close in. I picked up the paper, my hands trembling. It wasn't a message. It was a receipt, dated for today from the gas station, with the words, "Time mode." When I looked up, the walls had changed. They were lined with mirrors, all showing different versions of the bathroom, some empty, others filled with shadowy figures I didn't recognize. And in every reflection, I wasn't alone. The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The gas station was nowhere in sight. My watch had stopped, and my phone wouldn't turn on. All I had was that receipt crumpled in my pocket. I still can't look at mirrors without wondering what's looking back. If you watched the whole thing, please go to my other videos and subscribe. Merry Christmas to all.